Definitely. Rejected. I presume throughout, but specifically, are you ready to let me know this morning what your plan is?
I will not testify.
All right. Is that your understanding, Mr. Weaver?
It is, Your Honor.
All right. And you have your expert witness coming in now. Is it your intention to rest after that witness?
It is, Your Honor.
All right. Y'all got any plans for rebuttal at the moment? Okay. All right. So we're on track. We'll probably be done in an hour or so.
I would say so.
All right. Go and bring your witness in. Bring the jurors up. Probably bring the witness up and bring the jurors in. But. Y'all need me to. Mr. Ray, did I cover everything yesterday? Do y'all need me to do anything else on the record with your client?
I don't think so. You just did it again when I stepped in.
Right.
That's sufficient.
All right, go ahead, Mr. Ray.
Your Honor, the defense will call Dr. Jonathan Arden. Dr. Arden, if you'll raise your right hand, you swear and affirm the testimony you'll give before this court will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
Have a seat.
Thank you.
When you get seated, go ahead and state your name for the record.
I'm Dr. Jonathan Arden. It's A-R-D-E-N.
And Dr. Arden, what do you do for employment?
I am a forensic pathologist. My primary employment is as a consultant in forensic pathology and medicine, and I also hold a part-time position as a forensic pathologist with the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of West Virginia.
And so I'm assuming, being a forensic pathologist, you went to medical school?
Yes, sir.
Where did you go to undergrad?
2 years at Johns Hopkins University, and then 2 years at the University of Michigan.
How about medical school?
University of Michigan.
And when did you graduate from University of Michigan Medical School?
1980.
That's the year I was born.
Go ahead and make me feel old.
Where did you do your residency at?
I did a 3-year residency in anatomic pathology at the New York University Medical School in New York City. And then I did a 1-year residency in forensic pathology at the Office of the Chief Medical Examiner for the state of Maryland.
All right. What's the difference? I'll just go ahead and hop in here. What's the difference between anatomical pathology and forensic pathology?
Well, to begin with, let's start with the more general definition of pathology. That is the medical specialty that studies the changes in the form or the function of the human body or its components. And when I talk about changes, we're talking about the effects of diseases or injuries. In the broad field of pathology, it's divided into 2 major pieces, one of which is anatomic pathology, and that is the pathology of the anatomy, the structures of the body. So you learn to interpret and diagnose the changes of the structures of the body, some of which you can see with the naked eye, hold in your hand, some of which require a microscope to examine, and you diagnose diseases and injuries. Then within anatomic pathology, if you take the broad general background of general medicine, anatomic pathology, and then you apply it primarily to the process of investigating and certifying certain types of deaths, and those deaths being, number one, deaths that occur by violence, which simply means any death that occurs by any kind of injury under any circumstances, excuse me, as well as any deaths that occur suddenly, unexpectedly, so people who die in public, for instance. That's the field of forensic pathology.
Okay. And if you need any water, there's some right there behind you.
I have some of this, sorry.
You're fine.
Thank you.
Now, after you finished your residency, what'd you do after that?
After I completed the training that I just described to you, I then spent 20 years as a full-time government medical examiner. I worked in 4 different offices, including 9 years with the City of New York, where I rose through a number of titles and finished as the first Deputy Chief Medical Examiner. That's the second in command to that system. I then spent about 5.5 years as the Chief Medical Examiner of Washington, D.C. Once I finished my 20 years of full-time government service, I then entered into the consulting work, that type of work that brings me here today, and overlapping with that, I spent about 1.5 years with a part-time position in Northern Virginia, where I was living at the time, as a community-based medical examiner. And then, more importantly, since 2008, so for about 16 years now, I've held a part-time position with the medical examiner system in West Virginia, in which I perform the functions of their medical examiners. In that job, I actually do autopsies, write reports, go to court, things like that. But so then, the first 20 years of my career was full-time government work, and the second 20 years has been mostly consulting work.
Okay. I'm assuming you're currently licensed to practice medicine.
I'm currently licensed in 5 states,
And
being
what states are those?
Florida, West Virginia, Maryland, Virginia, and I hold a license in an inactive status in New York.
Okay. Are you a member of any of the relevant organizations regarding forensic pathology?
Currently a member of the Florida Medical Association. I have been actually for about 35 years. I was a member of the National Association of Medical Examiners.
Okay. Have you done any teaching?
Excuse me?
Teaching?
During the course of my career, I have done teaching, particularly when I worked in New York City and Washington, D.C. I held academic appointments, and I did more teaching in those years. That's about 14, 15 years out of my 20 years of my career.
And what universities did you teach at or lecture?
In New York City, I had appointments in both the New York State University Medical School in Brooklyn, as well as the New York University Medical School in Manhattan. And in Washington, D.C., I was appointed in the George Washington University Medical School in the pathology department.
And how about any lectures or presentations? Do you do any of that?
I have over the years given a fair number of them, especially, again, my busiest time of teaching and lecturing was in New York and Washington, but I've provided various kinds of lectures to medical offices, medical audiences, law enforcement, lawyers. So I've done a fair amount of that over the years. I've given presentations at national meetings a number of times as well.
And over the course of your now 44-year career or so, how many autopsies have you done?
I've personally done something over 3,000 forensic autopsies, plus whatever autopsies I did in training prior to that. And I haven't kept track, but I've probably had at least 500 other examinations of bodies without a full autopsy where I've issued death certificates.
Okay. And how many cases do you think that you have consulted on?
Oh, I haven't added that up. For the number of years in my consulting practice, I was taking about 125 to 150 new cases a year, trying to get myself towards something that sounds like retirement. We're probably taking around 65 new cases a year now.
How many times over the course of your career do you think you've testified in court?
Oh, probably around 5 years ago or so, I was still saying over 900 times testifying in court, hearings, grand juries, depositions all together. That's been years, so it's well over that now.
Okay. And how many different states in the U.S. have you testified in? And we'll just make it easy. How many times have you testified actually in court in front of a jury in the U.S.?
I don't actually have that number. I mean, it's a number of hundreds. It's probably more than 500 in front of a jury.
Okay.
In terms of states, I haven't counted that up lately either, but it's probably somewhere in the 25 to 30 state range, plus federal courts, plus military courts martial.
Okay. And what about, have you done any consulting work or testified in any foreign countries?
Yes, I actually testified by video in Montenegro a number of years ago. I've testified once or twice in Canada. I've consulted on cases that have not, or at least not yet, ended in testimony in England and Israel as well.
Have you been qualified as an expert witness before?
Yes, hundreds of times.
Hundreds of times? You know, at this point, we would move Dr. Arden in as an expert in the field of forensic pathology.
All right, any objections?
No, Judge.
All right, he's tendered as an expert and is thus can testify to his opinion based upon things in his range of experience. All right, go ahead.
Dr. Arden, for the jury, explain what a medical examiner is.
Well, in this country, every jurisdiction has some form of a medical legal death investigation agency, and roughly half of the country is covered by agencies called medical examiners, and about half are covered by coroners. Those are somewhat different systems. We don't really need to belabor the politics of it or the constitutional end of it, but so a medical examiner's office is the office that is charged under the law with the kind of work that I told you is what forensic pathology does. The medical examiner's office is the one that investigates the deaths that come under its jurisdiction, either deaths due to injury, deaths that are sudden, unexpected, and unexplained, some other special categories, deaths in custody in some places, deaths due to public health hazards. So that's what the medical examiner office does. And the process that I outlined or I defined for you is investigate and certify. So it starts with an investigation. You have to figure out what are the circumstances, where did the dead person come from, how did this happen, because it gives you your context. Just like you go to see your doctor, you don't hide behind a curtain and say, figure me out. You come in and say, I have a cough, I have a fever, or whatever, and your physician knows that it makes a difference if you're a 4-year-old girl or a 90-year-old man as far as what the doctor's looking for. So the investigation is like the history. And then the examination is usually the autopsy of the dead body, and sometimes it also includes toxicology or other examinations, x-rays, things like that. And so that's how the medical examiner office works. And if you're asking what is a medical examiner in terms of the professional, the medical examiner is a forensic pathology who performs all of those functions.
Okay. You were hired by myself and John Luke Weaver as a consultant on this case, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. How much to date are you aware of? Like, how much have we paid you?
I believe I've been paid in fees up to now just about $6,600. I mean, I've been working on this case since January of 2021 with your office. And so I think at this point it's been just about $6,600 total. There are some other hours in there that haven't yet been paid, and plus the appearance today.
Okay. Does the fact that you are compensated by my office, does that change your opinion of what you're going to testify to today?
No, I offer my opinions based on the facts and accepted medical practice and my 40 years of experience, and you get the same opinion whether you're paying me or not, or whether it helps you or not. It's all based on the facts.
All right. Well, let's go ahead and jump into the facts. Tell the jury what all in this case have you reviewed?
First of all, I reviewed investigative reports from law enforcement, mostly from the Cherokee County Sheriff's Office. I believe there was one report from the marshal. And there were also various reports from the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, the GBI. That includes from their medical examiner's office the autopsy report and the anthropology report initially done by Dr. Gooding. That includes photographs that were taken, I'm kind of lumping together between law enforcement and the GBI, but photographs of the death scene or the recovery scene, photographs of the examination of the remains by the anthropologist and by the pathologist, x-rays, or actually I got photos of the x-rays taken of the remains. I think I also saw some photos that were from the house at the site where the burn pit was. From the GBI, I also reviewed some other laboratory reports. There was a laboratory report about looking for accelerants, in other words, chemicals that might have been used to fuel that fire. Unless I'm missing something, I think those were all the documents that I examined.
And you're not going to approach?
I'm going to show you what has been pre-marked as
Pardon, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Can you identify 1 through 3?
Well, you just handed me our marked Arden 1 through 3 inclusive are 3 photographs taken of portions of the remains of Mr. Farris. These are photographs that I recognize that were taken during the time in June of 2022 when I personally examined the remains at the coroner's office here.
Okay, and that was my next question. So you actually went and reviewed the remains of Mr. Farris personally?
I did.
Okay. And I'm going to show you what is 4 and 5. You don't need to read them, just identify what they are and if they're true or correct.
What you've handed me is Arden 4 is a copy of my curriculum vitae or CV. That's my professional resume, total of 6 pages. That is complete. And Arden 5 is a copy of the consultation report. Actually, it looks like it's 2 copies. Yes, this is actually 2 copies of my consultation report that I wrote in December of 2023 for this matter.
Okay. And I will, apparently my stapler got the best of me this morning. Tender 1 copy. You know, at this time we go to move into evidence, Arden 1 through 5, the photograph, CV, as well as his report.
All right, admitted. You need the screens.
Please. Dr. Harden, I'm showing, can you, well, we're waiting on the screens to come on. While that is coming up, when you were reviewing the remains, did you notice any damage to the bones of Mr. Farris other than thermal damage?
Right. Other than thermal damage, no. I did not find any kind of damage or injury to the bones that would suggest any other form of trauma, thermal damage.
Just going through it, you didn't observe any saw marks?
Correct. No saw marks, no knife marks, no bullet wounds in the bones either.
Now, for the jury, tendering Arden 1, can you identify what this is?
Yes, this is a photograph of several of the fragments of bone and tissue. You can see there is a tag that was with these fragments that's identifying them as tissue fragments that had a bullet in them, and I can tell you that you can see on our left there below the tag is a portion of a rib. The roughly triangular darkened fragment on our right is some burned soft tissue with another portion of rib. That's where that bullet had been recovered.
And just so we're clear, is the triangular portion on the left side of Arden 1, is that soft tissue with a rib still attached or inside of it?
Yes, I think you said left side. That's our right side.
Yeah, that's the right side, sorry.
But yes, the one that you're circling with the cursor, that's exactly what that is.
Soft tissue with a rib.
Yes.
Okay.
Portion of a rib.
Portion of a rib. Okay. And Arden, I think that's Arden 3. What is that? Can you identify?
Oh yes, that is
actually that's Arden 2.
Okay, what you're showing as Arden 2 is a slightly closer up view of the same set of fragments. Now you can see the rib fragment that was toward the left, and another fragment of tissue that was the one of the bottom one in the first in Arden 1, and you can just barely see to our right the edge of that bigger triangular fragment.
And this last one. And for the jury, can you tell them about how you went about examining the remains at the coroner's office?
Well, the remains had been stored in various bags and organized in terms of which segment of the burn pit they had been removed from. Dr. Gooding had, in her exam and her report, basically divided up the area into 4 quadrants, A, B, C, and D, and the human remains and the fragments that were removed from each of them were labeled as to where they came from and bagged and tagged as to where they came from. So I essentially was provided access to all of those bags as organized and labeled, and then went through each and every one of them, opened them up. Some we opened, and some I believe we just examined through the bag. The areas that were more important, such as what you were seeing in Arden 1, 2, and 3, we took out of the bag, laid out, took the photos. I got to handle them and look at them in different directions, things like that.
And kind of jumping around, because that's how I do it. Through your review of this, did you notice or were able to determine whether any flammable or ignitable liquids had been used in this fire?
Based on the laboratory report from the GBI, which was testing to determine if there were any flammable liquids, what we call generically accelerants, the laboratory report did not identify any accelerants related to this fire or these remains.
And I'm going to show you what has been previously admitted as, we'll go with Gooding 10. Did you review this photograph to the best of your knowledge?
If it's part of the photos from the Gooding material, yes, I did. Actually, now that I look at this carefully, I did review this. I have seen this photograph, yes.
Okay. Can you explain to the jury what this is?
Yes. What you're looking at here, just slightly right of center, you see the vertical whiter band. That's a portion of a rib. You can see to our left there's a hand in a black glove holding the fragment, and the more orange kind of cylindrical item that's almost dead center in the photograph is in fact that bullet that was recovered from the soft tissue associated with that rib.
Now, with the portion of the rib that you were able to examine, did you notice any damage to the rib from that bullet?
No, there was no damage to the rib or any of the bones in this area. The bullet was simply in the associated soft tissue.
Okay. And I'm going to show you next. This is Gooding 11. This was attached to her report. Have you seen this photograph?
Yes, I've seen this diagram.
All right. You weren't here and you didn't hear it, but I'd asked Dr. Gooding where the bullet was found. And the best that she could tell me, essentially it's on the left side of the body. Is that what this photograph is showing for you and your medical opinion?
Yes, I think she's indicating here with the brackets that the rib fragments with the small area of soft tissue where the bullet was were from left ribs. If I recall correctly, she said in her report, sternal ends of left ribs. So the sternum is the breastbone, and the ribs each rib starts attached on each side of your backbone, your vertebral column, and goes around and slightly downward from your side to your front, and then the ribs attach through cartilage, soft tissue, with the breastbone, the sternum. So she was referring to these being the rib ends that are closer to the front, but it was left-sided ribs.
Okay. Now, would you say that the bullet, as you previously testified, the bullet is in the soft tissue? Can you explain, give us any indicator of where that bullet may be according to Gooding 11?
It was in the soft tissue between two of the ribs, close to the front, close to the breastbone. So you have, if you think about the anatomy, you have the skin on the outside, you have a layer of fat underneath the skin, which is normal. Everyone has a layer of what we call subcutaneous fat. And then in this area of the body we're talking about, you have the chest wall, which has the ribs, and there are muscles, some muscles on the front of those ribs, and there's a band of muscles that goes in between each of the ribs. And they're called intercostal muscles, which is a fancy medical term that means in between ribs. So you have this chest wall of the skin, the underlying fat, the ribs with all of their muscles that makes a structure there. It's the outside, the boundary of your chest, and that's all. If you're going from the outside in, that's all before you get into the body cavity. We haven't reached the next layer deeper. Would be in the body cavity, where, for instance, your heart and your lungs are.
And so the body cavity is where all the vital organs are contained.
Yes, we have. Technically speaking, we have two separate chest cavities where each lung sits. You have a compartment in the middle in the chest, which is anatomically separate. That's called the mediastinum, which is where the heart and major blood vessels are and some other structures. You have another separate cavity in the abdomen down below, which isn't related to this, so I won't belabor that. But yes, inside the cavities is where you have all the vital organs, the major blood vessels. What we're talking about here are tissues on the chest wall. They're not inside the body cavities.
Did you also review the autopsy in this case?
Yes, sir.
All right. Did you notice anything odd about the autopsy, the actual report?
Well, the thing that I noted in my report about the autopsy report is that the autopsy report is essentially administrative details, who did what when, and the vast majority of the autopsy report actually is cut and paste from Dr. Gooding's anthropology report. The only part of the autopsy report that has its own independent examination reported is there's a paragraph of the examination of the X-rays taken by the medical examiner.
Okay. Now, from your review of everything that you looked at in this case, can you tell the jury to a medical certainty where the entry wound is?
I cannot.
I'm seeing if do we still have the projectile in here? What's up here? I know you hadn't actually seen the projectile. Maybe it's up here. We've got to do all this again. But there was, you recall, the pedals on the projectile, right?
Yes, it was what we call a jacketed bullet. It has a lead core with an outer copper-colored coating, and many of those jackets have pedals, they call them, on the nose end of the bullet, such that when the bullet enters a tissue, those pedals can peel back, which is what happened in this case.
And can you determine anything about the path of a bullet potentially regarding whether or not those pedals are pulled back on the jacket of a projectile?
You really can't. Assuming the bullet enters nose first, which is typically what happens, as it encounters the tissue, the resistance of the tissue can peel back those petals off of the nose of the bullet, and this is commonly how a bullet like this is designed, that as it expands, the nose of the bullet expands, the petals peel back, it causes greater resistance. So this bullet is now transferring more of its energy to the tissue that it's going into and through, so it creates greater damage. Now, if you find a bullet in the tissues, and if you can determine or maybe assume that the bullet simply went in a straight line and ended pointing in the same direction it was going, well, then the petals of the jacket will be peeled back, showing you that that's the nature of the peeled back in the opposite direction of what the travel of the bullet. Now, on the other hand, if that bullet goes into the tissue, and while it is deforming and the petals are peeling back, that bullet tumbles, turns, in any way isn't facing straight ahead anymore, well, then when you find it in the tissue, the direction of the petals going backwards doesn't reflect the direction of travel of the bullet anymore. So you could have it either way. It may be something that tells you the direction. It may not.
So from looking at the rib and the soft tissue that you examined and the bullet, can you give any type of opinion about the trajectory of the projectile?
No. And in fact, that's consistent with what's in the autopsy report. Given the nature of these remains, which were very severely burned, we don't have an intact body, we don't have an intact surface, and it was stated clearly in the autopsy report, and I agree with this. We don't know where the bullet entered, we don't know which direction it was going, and we don't have any evidence of distance, what we call range of fire. So no, we can certainly say where that bullet ended up, and I can then provide you opinions based on, depending upon where we believe that bullet came from, what it did or did not do. But no, I can't tell you where that bullet entered.
Okay. And you reviewed Dr. Gooding's report, right?
I did.
Right. And you were aware that in her report she said that based on the peeling back of the bullets that it was a front to back or posterior to anterior. Is that right?
Well, front to back, yes, that would be anterior to posterior.
Okay, there we go.
Let's just go with front to back. That's easier.
All right, thank you. So front to back. Now, since you can't determine if there's an entry wound, can you determine any type of wound path based on what you've reviewed so far?
No, sir.
In your opinion, based on what you reviewed regarding just the rib and the projectile itself, did that projectile enter the body cavity?
Based on where it was located, there is no evidence that permits a conclusion that that projectile did enter the body cavity.
And what would, let me pull up another photo real quick. So, I had asked during her cross-examination, Dr. Gooding, where that bullet was, and she was very adamant that it was on the inside of the rib. Now, based on your photographs and your review of all of these reports, can you tell this jury whether it's on the inside of a rib or the outside of a rib?
It looks to me like it is somewhere between the ribs and maybe just a little bit inside. It's not very deep to that rib at all, though. So it's really still in that chest wall kind of anatomy that I described. It's not inside the body. It's not in the body cavity.
As a forensic pathologist, if something was just barely on the inside of a rib, would you still say that that is inside or outside the body cavity?
My best assessment of this bullet, as it's shown here, it is not inside the body cavity. It's inside the body. It's outside the body cavity.
Now, from your review, have you been able to form an opinion about how the bullet may have wound up in that location and not damaged any vital organs?
Yes, sir.
Okay, what is that?
This bullet, as I said, is not inside the body cavity as it's recovered. It could have gotten to that location following many different kinds of wound pathways. It is certainly among the many different possibilities that you can have a bullet wound that travels very tangentially. It's shallow in the body wall that enters, stays in the soft tissue outside the body cavity, and ends up in that location. So it could come from many different directions. If it's not a straight-in shot that goes straight from the front directly in, but it comes more from the side, for instance, it could easily, I've seen bullets do this before, it could easily enter, I'm motioning on my own left side of my chest, strike the body at a shallow angle, enter under the skin, stay in the chest wall, travel toward the middle here, end up in precisely that kind of location, and never once enter the body cavity or injure any organs.
Now, did you also examine the skull remains?
Yes, sir.
Right. What did you find from that?
The skull bones had been pretty severely fragmented from the burning process. Dr. Gooding actually did a major job trying to reconstruct as many of the skull bones as she could to put the fragments back together. It was quite a job. And my examination of the skull bones and the photos of her reconstruction tell me that they were all damaged due to the fire. There was no evidence in the skull bones of any other kind of injury. So in other words, there was no positive evidence of a gunshot wound to the head, for instance.
Can you make, based on your review, any findings that there is more than one bullet that Mr. Farris was potentially shot more than one time?
No, there's no positive evidence of any other gunshot wound.
What do you mean by, that's kind of the first time I've heard somebody say that. What do you mean by positive evidence?
I mean another bone that has what is clearly a bullet hole in it, for instance. Another area of soft tissue with a bullet recovered from it. You know, no actual evidence of damage by a bullet is what I'm referring to.
Okay. And jumping around again, you're familiar with manner of death and cause of death?
Yes, sir.
Can you explain to the jury what manner and cause of death are?
Cause of death is defined to be the specific process, whether that's a disease or an injury, that sets in motion an unbroken sequence of events that ends with the death of the person, causes the death of the person. So it's pretty much defined by what the words mean. You have to reach a specific conclusion of what it was that ended up causing the death. Manner of death is a construct that we use in medical examiner and forensic pathology practice as a part of the classification of vital statistics. Manner of death is really the circumstantial explanation for how the cause of death occurred. And so manner of death is probably easier to understand if I give you what the choices are. The choices are natural, meaning death caused only by natural disease; accident, which is death caused by an injury that was unforeseen or unintended; suicide, which is the intentional taking of one's own life by injury; homicide, which for forensic pathology purposes, this is vital statistics, this is not criminal law. Homicide, for our purposes, means death at the hands of another. You die from an injury caused by another person. And there's no judgment when we say manner of death or homicide, whether it is or is not a crime. That's a whole separate issue. And then the fifth and final choice for manner of death is undetermined. If you don't have enough evidence to make a conclusion to a reasonable medical certainty that it is this one or that one, or if you have evidence that permits more than one of the choices and you can't really separate them, one's likely and one's unlikely, then you can go with undetermined.
From your review of everything that you looked at in this case, can you make to a medical certainty a finding as what the cause of death was for Gary Farris?
I cannot.
And Can you state whether or not that well, I'm assuming you can't state whether or not the projectile caused any death.
Right. In fact, that's the point. I cannot tell you to medical certainty that the projectile found in his chest wall soft tissue was the cause of his death, because unfortunately, given the state of his remains, we cannot trace a bullet pathway from one place to another where that bullet ended up. So we do not have evidence that says to any medical certainty that that bullet caused an injury that caused his death. It could have, but just as equally possible, it didn't. So I can't say that that bullet killed him, and I have no evidence that affirmatively allows me to conclude that another bullet entered his body. So under the circumstances of the condition of his remains, I don't have enough evidence to say what killed him. So I don't know what his cause of death was.
So as a medical examiner, if you can't determine cause of death, what do you do?
Well, then you're stuck with admitting the limits of information and what you can do, and you cause of death undetermined.
Okay. So that's a possibility, saying cause of death is undetermined.
Oh, sure. I mean, this is well recognized. Every medical examiner, every forensic pathologist has been through cases like that. They're generally a small percentage of all the deaths that you investigate, but every medical examiner office has a couple or 5% of cases where cause of death, manner of death, or both are undetermined.
How many cases have you had where just you can't determine cause of death?
I haven't kept a record of how many. I mean, it's something I've done on numerous occasions over the years. I'm sure I've had at least one or two in the past year or two. And of course, I'm doing a more limited number of autopsies since I'm not a full-time medical examiner anymore. But I've probably had in 40 years at least a couple of dozen cases, maybe more.
Okay. And moving to the manner. Do you have an opinion as to what you could say to a medical certainty regarding the manner of death?
I do.
What is that?
Actually, in this case, in part because we do not have definitive evidence of the cause of death, and in part because, as far as I understand, we do not have definitive evidence of how Mr. Farris ended up in that fire. We do not have evidence that an accelerant was used to try to burn him up. Frankly, I think the intellectually honest conclusion here is that his manner of death is undetermined as well. I don't really know the circumstances of how and why he died. I don't know the circumstances of how and why his body ended up in that fire. Unfortunately, I mean, it's not real satisfying, but again, I think the intellectually honest answer is I don't know, and that's what an undetermined is for.
And have you had cases in your career where you're saying undetermined cause, undetermined manner?
Sure.
Okay. Have you had any recently?
I think I've had at least one case like that in my West Virginia experience fairly recently, yes.
Okay. Was there a case in Washington where you were undetermined manner, undetermined cause, or something vice versa?
Yes, I've had cases like that. I mean, the most famous case I worked on probably in my whole career was the death of Chandra Levy in Washington, D.C., the federal government intern who disappeared and was found skeletonized in the park about 9 months later in the woods. She was an undetermined cause of death.
Okay. How about manner of death, though?
Actually, I certified her manner of death as homicide.
Okay. And so why could you certify her death homicide but couldn't do Gary Farris's homicide?
Well, in her case, the circumstances actually were quite compelling that she didn't get there and die on her own. She disappeared unexpectedly, mysteriously. She ended up in a part of the woods in a very large urban park where she wouldn't have been otherwise. It's a huge park where people walk and run and hike, but she's on a slope, a wooded slope where people wouldn't go. She's found with, I think, only one article of clothing, her panties. The totality of those circumstances were such that it was clearly much more likely than not that she got there through the acts of another person. And that permitted me to say, again, from the standpoint of cause and manner of death, not a medical examiner doesn't determine crimes, but that her cause of death was undetermined based on the condition of the limited condition of her skeletonized remains, but the circumstances were compelling that she got there through the acts of another person, and so I certified her manner of death as homicide.
And so you can't say that Gary Farris is a homicide because you can't show how he got to the burn pile, evidence of how he was actually on the burn pile, things like that?
Correct.
Okay. And just one more question for the jury. In your expert opinion, what would the manner and cause of death be for Gary Farris?
My opinion is his cause and manner of death are both undetermined.
Okay. No further questions, Judge.
All right. Ms. Megan?
Good morning.
Morning, ma'am.
Good to see you again. All right, I want to talk about your consulting first, and then we'll get into the facts of the case, okay?
Sure.
What is your hourly rate for your testimony?
My hourly rate for all the work in this case is $450 an hour. Considering that this is a full-day trip out of town, actually an overnight trip, I have a flat rate of $4,500 for the trial date.
And that is the outstanding fee is still left, or is that part of the $6,600?
That's an outstanding fee.
You advertise your consulting on your website?
I do.
Do defense attorneys contact you directly to consult on cases?
Attorneys contact me directly. That includes criminal defense attorneys, civil attorneys, on occasions prosecutors.
Okay. And you mentioned some trainings and teachings, and you mentioned training and teaching attorneys. That would also include defense attorneys maybe in that training as well.
I have, over the years, trained defense attorneys, prosecutors, and civil attorneys.
You mentioned that the majority of your career currently is consulting, and then you do the part-time ME.
Yes, ma'am.
Is that right? Okay.
Correct.
So from your consulting, how much are you making in salary from your consulting?
We're a corporation. I think my corporation pays me about $250,000 a year now, something like that.
So you've mentioned you've testified how many times as an expert?
Some years ago it was over 900, and I've stopped counting basically.
That's criminal and civil?
Criminal and civil, trials, depositions, hearings.
Okay, so not just trials. That's overall. It could be a deposition in a civil lawsuit. You're including that as well?
I am.
Okay, not just jury trials.
Correct.
Okay. Do you know how many times of those you've testified out of the criminal matters were for the defense and then for the government?
I can't give you any numbers on that. I can tell you that in 20 years of government service, I probably had about 500 testimonial appearances in criminal matters called by the government. Since I've become a consultant, it's been a handful of cases where I've testified called by the government in criminal matters. And about half of my cases are criminal and half are civil in my consulting work, so kind of gives you an idea of the distribution.
Sure. All right, I want to talk about gunshot wounds generally. Now, you worked in New York and D.C., so I imagine you've seen a fair share of gunshot wound victims.
I have, yes.
So the seriousness and the damage a gunshot wound causes is dependent upon many factors.
It is.
Is that fair?
Yes.
It could even go towards the type of ammunition used.
That's one of the many factors.
We talked about the peddling of the projectile or mushrooming of the projectile. You said that that causes greater damage.
Yes, the whole purpose of that is such that the bullet continues to impart its energy to the tissues and tends to keep bullets staying inside instead of going through and through.
So the purpose is to transfer energy. You mentioned the energy of the bullet.
Yes, ma'am.
One of those factors, as far as the seriousness or damage of the gunshot wound, is the velocity, how fast it's traveling.
That is indeed one of them.
If it hits something and tumbles or anything like that, could completely change the velocity or speed of the projectile.
If the projectile interacts with an intermediate target before hitting the body, it could change the speed, it could change whether it's flying straight and true. Yes.
Mr. Ray discussed with you the wound path or the entrance wound and exit wound, and dependent upon where the wound enters and where the bullet enters and where the projectile exits, you don't know the amount of damage until you see inside the body, right?
That's correct, yes.
And in those scenarios, you won't know what organs are hit until you open the body.
Most of the time, yes, that's true.
And you have already testified you determine the wound path based upon the exit and entrance wound.
The entrance wound, and if there is an exit wound, will generally define the wound path. The internal examination, especially if the bullet doesn't exit, is the other component of determining the wound path.
And without an entrance wound or an exit wound, you cannot tell where that bullet, the path that bullet took.
Pretty much. I mean, I could probably dream up some kind of oddball exception of some bodies where you may see internal damage without being able to determine entrance or exit on the surface, but for the most part, I think, yes, you're right.
Gunshot wounds can vary in size.
Yes, ma'am.
And that would in turn vary in the damage done to the body.
Well, I guess it depends upon what you mean by size. If I was thinking of size of the wound on the skin surface, the size of the damage internally can be different in different kinds of gunshot wounds, and that would probably more directly relate to your question about the damage, yes?
I want to talk about, you mentioned energy of the bullet entering the body, and it can transfer energy to the rest of the portions of the body. Is that fair to say?
The bullet transfers energy to the tissues it strikes and some of the tissues at some distance from the actual path of the bullet as well.
I have a couple of more, based on your experience and what you've seen out there. Have you ever seen a bullet travel through the body and rest near the surface of the skin without exiting?
I have, yes.
Or even partially exiting, but remaining within the body?
Yes, I've seen that as well.
And when, I don't know if you call them decedents or bodies or patients, I'm not sure the word that you use.
Decedent is a good word.
Okay. When a decedent is sent to you for examination, have you ever experienced where you open the bag that the decedent is in and a bullet has either fallen out of its body or out of its clothing that nobody caught, anything like that?
Yes, I have.
Now, I want to talk about this case specifically. You unfortunately did not have any organs to examine in this case.
Correct.
So you can't actually say if organs were damaged or not.
That's true.
And based upon the location of the bullet, I'm going to pull up that lovely diagram that Dr. Gooding made. Gooding 11. The location of the projectile was towards the sternum, correct?
Correct.
And right behind the sternum is the heart and a portion of a lung.
Yes, right behind the sternum is the pericardium, which is the sac surrounding the heart itself, parts of the great vessels, and sometimes a part of the left lung will overlap that in the front.
Have you seen cases where a bullet causes internal bleeding?
Many times, yes.
And even times that there may not be a lot of external bleeding from gunshot wounds.
That can happen, yes.
Now, the bullet itself may not be the only source of the damage to a body. Is that fair to say? So, as far as transferred energy, a rib could become fractured and puncture a lung or something of that nature.
You can have secondary damage, such as bone fragments that are injuring a part of the body, yes.
So right behind the bullet in this case are vital organs.
Yes.
And you've already mentioned the word intercostal. I had that written down in my notes, and that means between the ribs.
It does.
So isn't it true that we have intercostal arteries?
We do.
And a lot of there's an entire vascular system that's located within those muscles, those intercostal muscles.
Well, there is an intercostal artery with its accompanying intercostal vein, one of which runs along the inside of the upper margin in a little groove of each rib. The soft tissues, you said vascular system, other than those, the soft tissues have very small blood vessels, the capillaries that are microscopic sized, but no other major vessels.
You mentioned in your report, well, let me take you back a little bit. In your testimony, you mentioned that medical examiners look at the context in which they receive a body. So you do investigate to an extent as a medical examiner to determine cause and manner of death.
Or I would prefer to say we do investigate, period.
You do investigate.
We
Okay.
do.
Okay. And you determine sort of a history of how that body came to you. Is that fair to say?
That's fair to say, yes.
Now, you mentioned in your report that it's possible Mr. Farris sustained multiple gunshot wounds.
There are many possibilities for which we don't have evidence. So yes, he has one gunshot wound. He could have had others, but we don't have evidence to determine that.
Okay. So were you unaware of the bullet found in the home that he shares with the defendant with his DNA on it?
No, I was aware of that.
Okay. So that, reasonably speaking, would infer he could have been shot multiple times.
Again, could have been. That actually doesn't determine that he was shot multiple times. But yes, it's a possibility.
Sure. So his soft tissue on a spent bullet, you're saying it's your testimony that that doesn't mean he was shot with that bullet?
Well, his DNA doesn't mean. His DNA could mean that his blood was on that bullet, that he touched that bullet, that that bullet went through a part of his body. There's many possibilities.
But again, we don't know if he was shot more than 2 or 3 or 4 times.
That's exactly the point. We don't know. Nobody knows.
How many total people would you say you've examined on your table before, physically examined?
Well, I'm over 3,000 autopsies, probably at least another 500 external exams. In terms of exams that I have personally done, I mean, that's the best estimate I can give you. I mean, I've seen thousands of other bodies on the autopsy table that I've either been asked to take a look at or consulted or supervised, but my own personal cases were in the 3,000, 3,500 range.
Mr. Ray mentioned this case where a woman was found in the woods, I believe.
She's found in a wooded area in a large urban park.
And you mentioned that that was a unique location that she may have not traveled to herself.
It's not a place where people normally would go, not her or pretty much anybody.
Would you say putting yourself in a burn pile then is a normal place you would go?
No. I mean, it's a possibility. Not typical, no.
Okay. Out of the number of individuals that you have examined what percentage of those, or just a guess, would have included a gunshot wound?
Well, first of all, I have a rule about not guessing under oath.
Sure.
So I won't
infer.
guess. I don't actually have statistics to tell you what percentage of my cases had gunshot wounds. I can tell you I've seen, at the barest minimum, hundreds of gunshot wound deaths that I personally autopsied.
And in those cases, some of them may have been suicides.
Yes.
But out of the ones that weren't, it's fair to say that those other individuals that had gunshot wounds that weren't from a suicide didn't survive.
Anybody who gets to the autopsy table did not survive by definition.
That's exactly right.
First thing they teach you in medical examiner schools, don't do autopsies on live people.
Right. I'm glad you don't. Thank you for that. So knowing that there was a spent bullet in the basement of the home with Mr. Farris's soft tissue on it, a bullet located within his body, and his body being found on a burn pile that in the reports indicate he did not fall onto, but was placed onto. It's still your position that that is not a homicide.
It's my position that the absence of definitive evidence means that an undetermined manner of death is appropriate. To be frank, yes, you have enough circumstances that you've outlined there that somebody could readily defend a conclusion that the manner of death should be homicide. I think we're missing a few pieces of information that I'd much rather have, but I'm not going to testify to you that calling this a homicide is completely illogical or wrong.
Thank you. That's all I have.
But you would still stand by that, based on the information that you've seen, that it's undetermined.
I would much prefer, if I were offering an opinion, if I am offering an opinion, that's my opinion. Undetermined is better.
All right. And just a couple brief follow-up ones. And I just let's just assume that Dr. Gooding's opinion that it is a front-to-back shot and it is a sternal rib end. Tell me where, to the best of your knowledge, where you think on the left side of the body that projectile is on those ribs. And if you look at the photo there, and just kind of guide me.
Right around, you've got the cursor, which is showing as a hand.
Yes.
And leave it right there. You now have that cursor overlying inside the bracket that Dr. Gooding put there, and those sternal ends of those ribs are the front, slightly to the left part of the body. And that is the general area where the tissue fragment with the bullet was found, represents. And so where you've got the hand cursor is, for broad approximation, about where that bullet was.
Okay. So if you're shot straight on and the bullet lodges in between two ribs right there, what kind of trauma are you expecting to see?
I'm expecting to see an entrance wound in the skin surface. I'm expecting to see some damage to the underlying tissues, including those muscles, and I'm expecting to see some bleeding associated with that. And that's probably it. There could be some bruising on the underlying lung, meaning that the impact of the bullet can cause bruising in deeper tissue where the bullet didn't hit, but that's about it.
Yeah. It wouldn't cause death, in your opinion?
If you've asked me to assume it was indeed, as Dr. Gooding opined, the front-to-back shot that ended up in that chest wall in the front, then yes, much more likely than not, it would not cause death. In fact, in cross-examination, the issue of intercostal arteries was brought up. The intercostal arteries are fairly small, and they arise from your aorta in the back, near the backbone area, and then follow each rib around. Intercostal artery bleeding from the part of the artery in the front is likely to be quite limited. On rare occasions, and I've seen this maybe once or twice in 40 years, an intercostal artery in the back where it's bigger can actually cause fatal bleeding, but that's extremely rare. So I would expect localized hemorrhage in the front, but not fatal bleeding and not fatal injury.
No further questions, Judge.
All right, Ms. Frankish, anything else?
Nothing else, Judge.
All right, sir. Thank you. You can step down.
Thank you, Your Honor.
All right, Mr. Ray, Mr. Weaver, anything else?
That's all, Your Honor. The defense will rest.
Any rebuttal from the state?
No rebuttal, Your Honor.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence is now closed. I'm going to take this time to remind you once again, we are at a critical stage in the proceedings. The evidence is closed. You're not to look up anything about the case, talk to anyone about the case, and I'm going to give you some more instructions when I dismiss you in just a couple of minutes. Once again, we're revising the schedule. I had promised the attorneys that I would give them a full day to prepare their closing arguments, which I anticipate is going to take about 2 hours for each side. They're going to give you most of them are going to do a PowerPoint presentation of some sort, and to get their slides together for that. They have agreed, based upon our discussions after I dismissed you yesterday, that if we broke by about 10:30 this morning, which we are going to do, that they could take the rest of today to prepare their closing statements, and that we would be able to do closing statements tomorrow. So everything I told you yesterday has been updated, and you can't go off to work or whatever you want to do tomorrow. We're going to do closing statements and jury charge, and then y'all will begin deliberations. Before we do that, I'm going to take a minute of personal privilege. The attorneys in this case have done a remarkable job presenting this case to you in a timely fashion. This case could easily have gone on for another week or two. And each time I announced my anticipated timeline, they worked to parse it down further, maybe based upon y'all's reaction to my proposed timeline. There easily could have been several more days of crime lab testimony, which they agreed to stipulate to the reports, to have one witness testify to things that witness didn't necessarily test, but knew enough about to present the information to you. They stipulated to the admission of a lot of the evidence in the reports. They didn't make unnecessary objections, and although we still sit you out numerous times, it could have been a lot more. Each of these attorneys has tried a jury trial in front of me or more. They've handled many more cases in front of me and appeared in front of me dozens of times, and each of them are outstanding lawyers. The Friday first week of trial, I don't know if you knew what we were doing after we broke, but we went next door to Judge Baker's courtroom because my courtroom is a disaster, and we swore in a new lawyer. And they're going to take photographs, and so we didn't want all this stuff in front of them. And so I asked each of the attorneys to come next door and participate in the ceremony with me. And as part of that ceremony, I had them each read a section of what's called the Lawyer's Creed, which is a set of aspirational guiding principles that lawyers should follow as members of the bar and of our profession, and they should treat opposing counsel with respect and courtesy and to act professionally. I want to commend each of you, Mr. Fogus, Ms. Frankish, Mr. Ray, Mr. Weaver, for embodying the words and spirit of those aspirational goals. The stakes in this case could not be higher. However, they did not let that pressure get to them. They've also had to try this case knowing that thousands of people are watching this case online and scrutinizing every minute of it and what each of them say and what each of them do. They didn't ask for this trial to be broadcast or for cameras to be in the courtroom. And none of us are used to being on TV and now have been made aware of our individual quirks, idiosyncrasies, and the number of times that we say or in a given day. They have done their best to ignore the media and not to play to the camera, but to present the case to you. They've treated each other and the witnesses in the court professionally and with respect. I appreciate it. I acknowledge it. I want to specifically do that in front of you, the jury. Thank you to each of you. I'm also doing this today because things might get a little heated tomorrow. Closing argument, to be expected, can be emotional, and I anticipate that they will continue to do their job to the best of their ability. All right. So again, thank y'all for that. Let's talk about the rest of the week. All right, we're going to do closing and charge tomorrow morning. As I said, I anticipate it's going to be lengthy. The case I tried right before I started with you, I had 3 defendants and the state, and each of them took an hour in that case. Because this is a murder case, I'm going to give each side 2 hours. But using that as my guide, by the time we got started, by the time we took breaks throughout each of their closing statements, and by the time I gave the charge to the jury, it was 2:30. And the jury had not eaten lunch. So we're not going to do that again. What I'm going to attempt to do tomorrow is for us to begin. The state gets the opportunity to open and conclude closing arguments. So the state will begin. They may go 30 to 45 minutes to start with. Then I'll let Mr. Ray or Mr. Weaver go for about an hour. They may want to split up their closings. I'm going to get the lawyers. Sometimes judges get caught up and only let one lawyer talk. I'm going to let whoever wants to talk on their side talk as much as they want. Or not as much as they want, but I'm going to limit it to about 2 hours. So at an appropriate time in the middle of defense's closing, we will break for 15 minutes, give you all an opportunity to stretch your legs. We'll then conclude closing statements for the defense. At that point, I'm going to attempt to do a 30-minute lunch break. We're going to order pizza in, give you all a chance to take a short break, eat something. Then the state's going to conclude closing arguments. If we need another break after their conclusion before I give you the instructions that I'm going to give you, which is going to be another 40 minutes, we'll take another break then if we need to. At that point, y'all will have the case. Now, we have to gather all the evidence and present it to you. We're going to try to do some of that today and get it somewhat organized and get y'all listed, the exhibits and that kind of stuff for tomorrow. So that's something else the state and the defense are going to work on. When y'all begin deliberations, my general rule is I let the jury determine how long you're going to be here and as late as you want to stay and when you want to come back the next day. I will offer suggestions to you and try to guide you somewhat, but for the most part, I let the jury make that determination. I think I have told y'all that we have been here till 2:30 in the morning before. That was the jury's call. If y'all want to stay tomorrow night, y'all are welcome to stay. If y'all stay past 6:30, 7 o'clock, we'll order some food in for you. If y'all decide after hearing closing statements that y'all just need a break for the day, that's fine too. We will be here the rest of the week and into next week if y'all need it. We will try to break a little. I'm going to suggest on Thursday, if y'all are deliberating most of the day Thursday, that we try to get out of here a little bit early on Thursday because it's Halloween and traffic will be terrible and everyone has kids and other activities planned for the day. So again, we have Friday and we have into next week, which is what I originally told y'all I thought the case would do. Other things, just to give you an idea, when we start deliberations, the bailiffs are going to take your devices away from you and they will be put in a box and they'll be left in the hallway during your deliberations while you're here in the jury room. I will give you an opportunity before y'all start deliberations to call home and say, we're starting deliberations. And you won't hear from me again until A, we have a verdict, or B, we decide to break for the evening. And then I'll be on the way home. And then that will be the case throughout the remainder of the deliberations as long as that takes. That way there's no mischief going on with your devices. There'll be separate instructions for the alternates. y'all may believe that you know who the alternates are, but that information that you may have gotten off the clerk's website may or may not be accurate. I will talk to the alternates tomorrow and give them a separate set of instructions. Any questions from y'all as to what your schedule is for the rest of the week? All right, y'all be here at 8:45 in the morning. We'll start closings as close to 9 o'clock as we can. There may be some things we need to get set up and make sure the equipment's working, but we'll try to get started as close to 9 as we can. And then I anticipate, like I said, it will be most of the day. We'll stand up and stretch as needed. We'll take breaks as needed. And hopefully y'all will have the case by early afternoon. All right? With that, y'all can be excused.